Welcome to the recorded version of the Grantmakers and Aging web seminar, The Retirement Income Crisis and Social Security, Creating Story Warriors to Win the Fight, featuring Stacy Easterling, Program Executive at the Atlantic Philanthropies, Nancy Altman, Founding Co-Director of Social Security Works, Eric Kingston, Founding Co-Director of Social Security Works, Ben Vecti, Research Director of Social Security Works, and John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers and Aging, from August 12, 2013. This event was made possible by a partnership between Grantmakers and Aging, the John A. Hartford Foundation, and the Atlantic Philanthropies. Technical and production support is provided by the American Society on Aging.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you to the audience who's joined us today and to our distinguished panel of speakers. This is part of our continuing series of monthly webinars on critical topics of interest to funders and aging. As Steve told you, today's session is on the retirement income crisis and Social Security, the power of narrative and Social Security. I'm glad so many of you have been able to join us today. Before we begin, I want to thank those whose support is making today's webinar available to funders and aging. The John A. Hartford Foundation of New York provides continuing support for the series, and the Atlantic Philanthropies is co-sponsoring this month's webinar. We also want to thank the expert team at the American Society on Aging for providing technical and production support for the series. As traditional sources of retirement security, such as pensions, personal savings, home values have eroded, and wages across the income spectrum have stagnated for over 4 decades, America is facing a retirement security crisis. For vulnerable populations and for much of the middle class, Social Security is now the only remaining reliable source of retirement income. Yet Social Security itself finds itself in the crosshairs of Congressional budget cutters. This webinar will present the latest data on what is at stake for vulnerable populations and the middle class in the Social Security debate. It will also address how support for Social Security can be buoyed through the power of narrative by training Americans to effectively tell their stories and create opportunities and forums where they can share these stories of what Social Security and the retirement income crisis mean to them. We are pleased to have some of our nation's best experts to help guide us through this discussion. Stacy Easterling is Program Executive at the Atlantic Philanthropies. Nancy Altman and Eric Kingston are Founding Co-Directors of Social Security Works. And Ben Vecti is the Research Director for Social Security Works. Welcome to all of our panel. Stacy, let's start with you. The Atlantic Philanthropies has supported Social Security Works. Why do you feel this is an important activity to provide economic security for older persons?
Thanks, John. And I first wanted to throw in the preamble that I'm not one of the experts, but I'm glad to know that we found the experts that can tell us the real story about what's happening with the retirement crisis. But for Atlantic, our main objective for economic security in our aging portfolios to enhance and protect the economic support for low-income elders. And for us, it's critical for older adults to have adequate resources as they retire from work. And we want to ensure access to stable sources of income and other benefits, but especially to the safety net resource that Social Security provides as sometimes the sole resource that people have. So over the past few years, we've invested in the formation of Social Security Works to lead a fact-based national effort to counter all the misinformation out there and to educate local and federal leaders and the media about Social Security, and to make a strong case for improving the benefits for the lowest wage and disadvantaged folks, and to amplify the voices of older adults telling their stories, to educate local and federal leaders, and also making the case for actuarially sound financing for the long term. And then most important, to establish an enduring capacity to protect Social Security from attacks in the future. Also, Social Security Works has created this powerful coalition called Strengthen Social Security, which is made up of 300-plus organizations united around the principle that Social Security benefits should not be cut, but should be improved for those most in need. That creates a louder and stronger unified voice around this issue. As our grant making winds down in the next couple of years, we know that the discussion of Social Security and the retirement income crisis will only get more intense. And we know that it's important to support building the capacity of groups that can be there for the long term, prepared for future needs, debates, and future education.
Thanks, Stacy. Eric, let's talk to you for a second. What are some of the important things to keep in mind as our members learn more about the retirement income security crisis today?
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone who's on the line, and Stacy. 4 quick points that I think are very important. First, the hard work of generations through their contributions and hard work, politicians, and also decisions made by foundations help create a dramatic improvement in the economic status for today's old and the old of the past 15, 20 years. It's investments that were made across life, particularly investments in creating Social Security. These are choices that were made and work that was done by all Americans and by our leaders. Second point, we can afford a good old age, we can afford a good middle age, a good young adult age, and a good childhood. What we face is a set of political choices, not economic limitations. We are a well-off nation. It's a question of how we utilize our resources to the best advantage of everyone. And just to add to that, when we talk about Social Security, we very clearly talk about all generations, not simply today's old, but how to protect people across the course of life. Third point, we face a fundamental set of choices about the kind of nation we want to be, the kind of old age we want to enable, and the values we want to pass on to future generations. This is very much at core of today's Social Security discussion. And the fourth point being, our Social Security system works. It will be the core part of any solution to the retirement income crisis we face today. This may be cohort specific, but to paraphrase Carly Simon, nothing does it better than Social Security. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Ben, let's bring you in as we move to the next slide. Tell us a little bit about what we'll be covering today.
Sure. Thank you. Well, we'll start out by talking about how far we've come in addressing retirement security since the days of the poorhouse before Social Security was introduced in 1935. Indeed, we've come a great ways since then. Then we'll discuss challenges for today's seniors. We all know from our own experience or from our parents or grandparents the challenges that Americans face today in making ends meet in retirement. We will then turn to challenges facing tomorrow's seniors, which in many ways are more grave than the challenges that we face today. And we'll then talk about the power of narrative to move the debate, ways that we can bring average Americans' voices into the media and policy discussions on retirement security. And finally, we'll discuss what can be done to address the crisis.
Great. As we move to the next slide, this slide reminds us of how far we've come from the quote-unquote good old days. Tell us a little about it.
Well, as you see, those days don't look all that good, John. Unfortunately, before Social Security was introduced in 1935, most seniors had little choice but to move in with their children once they retired, or to work until they died. Or some who couldn't work ended up in the poorhouse, and that's was not a rare occurrence. There were poorhouses in every state, I believe, except New Mexico before Social Security was introduced. So it's a very real problem that America faced back in the 30s and indeed prior to that. And Social Security went far in solving that problem. The fact that photo looks so foreign to us today tells us how far we've come.
As we go to the next slide, sometimes we hear these days that Social Security used to be important, but now everyone relies on private retirement savings. How important is Social Security for retirement now?
Well, private retirement savings have certainly helped over the decades, but they have had certain limits. Scholarly analyses of have shown that almost the entire reduction in elderly poverty since the 30s, from what was 50% poverty among the elderly in the 30s during the Great Depression to 9% today, is due to Social Security. As more and more people aged into their earned benefits, as they worked for decades and paid into the system and then retired and received their benefits, as more Americans did that, the rate of poverty steadily declined in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it is sort of leveled off since the early 1980s at around 9%, which is mostly due to Social Security. And what it has done is given seniors the ability to retire with independence, the dignity of financial independence, to be able to retire on their own budget without having to, ask family members for support, without having to move in with family members, the ability to live independently, and not be a burden on their children. So it's not simply an economic issue; it's also an issue of quality of life in retirement.
To move to the next slide, what are the challenges for today's seniors?
Well, as we all know, we all know that healthcare costs have been increasing and that wages have been stagnating since the early 1970s. And what that has done, the two of those together have made it harder for people to accumulate earned benefits in Social Security. People's benefits are lower than they would have been if wages have been increasing over the last 4 decades. And at the same time, healthcare costs have been rising for several decades now, which is cutting into the discretionary income of seniors in retirement. On top of those two trends is the fact that since the 1983 reforms to Social Security, the reforms that came from the Greenspan Commission, on which both Eric Kingston and Nancy Altman served, the reforms from that commission, in trying to balance out Social Security's finances for the long term, actually cut Social Security benefits. So benefits were cut by just under 20% over the long term in the 1983 reforms, and those benefit cuts have been slowly taking effect. The largest one being the increase in the retirement age from 65 to 67, which is an effective cut at any age that you retire. So that is a big challenge for today's seniors. Today, 15.1% live in poverty, according to the most up-to-date measure, the Supplemental Poverty Measure. It's a very large rate of poverty for seniors, and it's a serious concern. 3 in 4 live on less than $50,000 a year, showing that there's sort of a myth inside Washington, D.C. that there is a large number of seniors who don't need Social Security, who live in gated communities or drive SUVs or are financially independent. But the data show that, for today's seniors, only 1 in 4 have even $50,000 a year or more. So most people absolutely need Social Security. Half of seniors today, if we take a broader measure beyond the poverty measure, half of seniors live on less than experts consider necessary to make ends meet and age in place with dignity. That is about 200% of the poverty level. Half of seniors live under that, including 3 in 4 African Americans and Latinos and 6 in 10 women. So beyond the issue of senior poverty, there is a broader issue of that half of seniors are struggling to make ends meet and are one economic shock away from being pushed into poverty. So it's not simply the poor that we're concerned about today, but a large, about half of seniors are in a precarious situation. And finally, there's a separate retirement income crisis late in retirement for the oldest old, where people who have accumulated maybe 401k savings or IRA savings, or they when they become, hit their late 70s and 80s, those assets have often been depleted. And a recent study from the Harvard Kennedy School, Dartmouth, and MIT found that 46% of seniors outlive their assets completely and die with less than $10,000 in assets, showing that, and they're relying almost entirely on Social Security in their final years of life. So the data show clearly that Americans haven't been able to save enough and that Social Security is critical to them in retirement. So
as we go to the next slide, how many people actually depend on Social Security?
Well, Well, Social Security, as you see in this chart, the blue area at the bottom of each of the columns is the share of Social Security in the income of seniors. So if you look at the data, Social Security provides more than 70% of income to the bottom three quintiles of the population. In other words, if you add up the three columns to the left of this chart, Social Security provides 70% of income to the bottom 60% of earners in retirement. So it's extremely important to more than half of the population. 2/3 rely on Social Security for half or more of their income. And so, quite a large number. And when you look on the far right quintile, people earning with more than $57,000 of income in retirement, most of those people are still working. You see the red portion of that column is very large. That's their earnings. But as soon as those people retire, and most people ultimately stop working by the time they turn 70 or in their early 70s, they slip into the earlier quintiles. In other words, Social Security becomes more and more important to their economic security. So really to almost all seniors, Social Security provides nearly half or more than half of their income in retirement.
To move to the next slide, an issue that I often hear talked about, which is, well, everybody has 401ks these days. Isn't this going to replace Social Security for most people eventually?
Well, I hear that too. But as you know, for people who work in white-collar jobs and are relatively well compensated, often do have 401ks. But the retirement income crisis is not a crisis of people who are high earners. It's a crisis of average Americans. And the data show, as you see in this graph, that only the highest quintile of Americans receive significant income from, and this is combined income from their employer-based pensions, 401k style plans, and IRAs. So the reason for that is that slightly less than 6 in 10 households have 401k or IRA income whatsoever. 4 in 10 don't have any income from these plans in retirement. So only the top 20% of seniors receive meaningful support from any kind of employer-based plan.
So go to the next slide. Those are fairly daunting challenges for today. What about the challenges facing tomorrow's seniors?
Well, unfortunately, the challenges facing tomorrow's seniors are even more daunting, John, because defined benefit pensions had provided an anchor for retirement security for many middle-class Americans in previous decades, and people who are retired today are still experiencing the remnants of that system. But unfortunately, in recent decades, defined benefit pensions have been declining. Employer-based pensions. They used to be the 24.3% of the population had such pensions in 1992. Today, only slightly less than 15% have such pensions. And most of those remaining ones are in the public sector. And as we know from watching the news lately, that those state, public sector pensions are under constant attack, and there's a coordinated attempt to reduce those or eliminate them or convert them into 401k plans. If we look at 401ks and IRAs, after 30 years of attempts by policymakers to ensure that all Americans have 401ks and IRAs and are able to save for retirement through them, among households nearing retirement, i.e. those who are between 55 and 64, 4 in 10 have no retirement account savings at all. In other words, they have no 401k, no IRA, a zero balance. 3 in 10 have accumulated less than $100,000 in these accounts as they're nearing retirement. And that's only enough for about $500 a month annuity for the rest of your life. Not a big supplement. Certainly not enough to live on. And another 3 in 10 have accumulated more than $100,000 in these accounts. So really, for only about 3 in 10 households have do 401ks and IRAs together provide any kind of meaningful retirement security. And of course, those 3 in 10 are not the people that policymakers should be concerned with, right? Public policy, in terms of addressing the retirement income crisis, is concerned about average Americans, and 7 in 10 are not able to save sufficiently through 401ks or IRAs. one striking statistic to assess the effectiveness of 401ks and IRAs is that the median, in other words, the medium account balance, in other words, half of people's balances are below this amount and half of households' balances are above this amount. The median balance for all households nearing retirement is $12,000. So half of Americans have been able to save less than $12,000 in 401ks or IRAs combined. So we certainly can't look to these plans as an alternative to Social Security.
As we move to the next slide, well, that's kind of amazing because baby boomers like myself have heard all of our lives that we needed to save for our own retirement because we would not be able to rely on Social Security and other programs. So how did we do?
Well, that's partly true, and partly, well, it's completely true that baby boomers certainly did need to save for their own retirement, and the good news is that we did do that, but we didn't do it through 401ks and IRAs. We did it through Social Security. In the 1983 reforms to Social Security, the increases in the payroll tax were moved forward so that revenues to the program were increased and benefits were also cut. And the combination of those reforms has led to an accumulation of a surplus in the Social Security system of $2.7 trillion. So today we have a $2.7 trillion surplus that baby boomers have paid into Social Security, in other words, overpaid into this program in order to save for their own retirement. And over the next 20 years, we'll be drawing down that $2.7 trillion surplus to pay our retirement, to pay baby boomers' retirement, and other disability and benefits as well through Social Security and survivors' benefits. So that's the good news. We have saved a great deal, and for the average working American, the amount that we've saved is worth about $250,000 in retirement assets. So in other words, as baby boomers have saved much more through Social Security than we have through our 401ks and IRAs. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that we haven't been able to save a great deal outside of Social Security. Among those nearing retirement, the median net worth of all households is only $179,000, which is about the same amount as the price of the average house, the median house sold last year. So in other words, the median net worth of the average house, the median net worth of all households is about the same as the value of our homes. So if we took all our assets and added them together, our 401ks, our IRAs, our savings account balances, et cetera, we could pay off our mortgage if we were lucky enough to own a home. We could pay off our mortgage, and then we would have nothing left except Social Security to live on. And so we really haven't been able to save enough to provide for our own retirement security outside of Social Security. And if we break that down by demographic subgroups, we see that Latino households have been able to save only $89,000, and African-American households only $20,000. Again, those are figures for households nearing retirement, so they don't have much time left to add to those savings. Now, if we look farther down the road to younger cohorts, for example, those aged 35 to 44 today, then the numbers are even, a little more disturbing. The median net worth of all households in that age group is only $42,000. For Latinos, $19,000, and for African Americans, only $12,000. So, the successive generations of Americans who are going to be retiring haven't been able to save, more than the current generation of retirees. So we can expect our current retirement income crisis to only get worse in coming decades if we don't take action. One final point to note is that if you look at student loan debt, which is a major concern to millennials, obviously, to Americans under the age of 33, it has risen 380% since 2003, going from a little over $200 billion to $1 trillion in 2013. We have $1 trillion of student loan debt in our economy, and most of that is to the youngest Americans. So young Americans are going to be paying that debt off into their 50s, and that debt burden will certainly inhibit their ability to save for retirement through a 401k or IRA. So Social Security is likely to be all the more important to them, and even more important to them than it is to us today.
Say, John, could I just add something in?
Sure.
Yeah, this is in case people who are listening aren't thoroughly depressed, have a little more information to get you there. One is that what we haven't also mentioned is the huge risk that long-term care costs the huge risk that they are for every middle class and all class households of older people today and tomorrow. That's a huge problem. When things were looking very good a few years ago, like we're making a lot of change, we used to say the biggest risk facing the middle class, older people, is long-term care costs. The other thing is that there's some data from the Retirement Research Center at Boston College that tells us that even if people work until age 65, fully 50% of them will not be able to maintain their standard of living in old age. And if you count in long-term care and health care costs, that number moves up probably to about two-thirds of today's working people, not retirees, working people. That's a huge crisis that we're facing moving out into the next 20 years, and especially for people in their 50s today who've lost housing equity, pension, and salary.
Well, you're certainly right, Eric, that this is a pretty sobering set of comments here and information. I do want to remind our audience that we will be having questions and answers at the end, and that you can go ahead and start typing your questions into the box labeled questions on the right hand of your screen. I will be reading those to our panelists as we move through towards the end of the material. So, Ben, let's go back to you on the next slide. And what's the impact of all of this on the retirees to come?
Well, the numbers that we've been discussing about how we haven't been able to save enough for retirement outside of Social Security suggest that for most of us, when we retire, we're going to experience downward social mobility. In other words, we're not going to be able to maintain our living standards. As Eric just mentioned, more than half of households age 30 to 59 today, headed by someone age 30 to 59 today, will not have saved enough to maintain their standard of living in retirement. More than half, and two-thirds will not be able to maintain their standard of living if you account for health care costs and long-term care costs. So unless we do something to increase our retirement security going forward, whether that's increasing Social Security benefits or somehow saving more through 401k and IRA plans or expanding defined benefit pensions, in other words, traditional employer pensions, if we don't do something, probably two-thirds of us will experience downward social mobility in retirement, which means that we may have to rely on our children for help to make ends meet at a time when our children are trying to help their children, get a good start in life. Or maybe we have to move in with friends or move in with our own children. It's a major crisis that is looming for all of us who plan to retire in the next decades. If we add up all the gap that all of us have between what we will have saved and what we're going to need in retirement, studies show that amount ranges between $6.6 trillion and $14 trillion. Somewhere, there's two different studies that have using one was more conservative and one was more liberal, but they estimated that we'll need somewhere between $6.6 and $14 trillion more in retirement savings as a country in order to meet the retirement income crisis. So what we're facing, John, is that decades of progress that we've made since the 1930s in creating an elderly middle class is poised to unravel in the coming decades if we don't take action. This doesn't need to be depressing information because obviously we still have time to take action, but if we don't take action, that's what it looks like.
Well, as we move to the last slide then in this section, I think I know the answer to this question. Does it get better with the next generation? I think you're going to tell us no.
Yeah, as this graph clearly shows, and this is from the data from the Pew Charitable Trust, that based on net worth of each generation today, and projections based on current net worth, if savings patterns continue, then when people retire, each successive generation is going to be able to replace a smaller percentage of their previous working income. So we see that those aged 58 to 67 today, if we take women, for example, they'll only be able to replace 2/3 of their previous working income. And then if we take women aged 48 to 57 today, when they retire, they'll only be able to replace 63%, and then the successive generation, only 51% of their income. So each successive generation is projected, assuming that the present patterns of saving continue until retirement, each successive generation is projected to be worse off in retirement. So this accounts for 401k savings, IRA savings, employer pensions, and Social Security. So unless we increase Social Security benefits or somehow manage to increase other forms of retirement saving, whatever crisis we experience today is going to be considerably worse for our children and grandchildren.
So we move to the next slide, then into our next section. You talk about the power of narrative here. What do you mean by the power of narrative, and why do you feel it can change the debate?
Well, as I'm sure anyone, all of us, participating in this webinar are coming to realize, there have been a lot of numbers put out there today, and those numbers tend to make you want to throw up your hands after a while because it's a lot of information, it's overwhelming, and people don't know what to do about it. The power of narrative is that it helps, it inspires people to take action, to identify with the stories being told, to perceive injustices, and want to help the underdog, as it were, to overcome obstacles. And research shows that narratives, that stories of average people affect the brain much differently than cognitive, than information that appeals to their cognitive senses.
And that's what the next slide tells us about, right?
Yeah, so, there's been a lot of research on this, and the studies have shown that cognition and intuition affect the human brain very differently. Obviously, cognition requires attention and effort, and so, if we watch on the news, say if we're watching a news report that says that 15.1% of Americans are poor today, of seniors are poor today, we may see that in the background, but then forget it quickly thereafter. But if it's a story that we see about an individual senior who is struggling to make ends meet, the brain retains that information for a much longer period of time, and it also inspires us to action much more. So I was talking about the difference between cognition and intuition. Stories are intuitive, and so people remember them better than they do rational arguments. They identify with actors in the story, and it inspires them to action to improve the situation being depicted in the story. John, opponents of Social Security for a long time have successfully used intuitive arguments to suggest that Social Security needs to be scaled back and replaced with private accounts. They've said we can't afford Social Security because baby boomers are aging, which sounds like it makes sense until you actually have more time to examine the issue. They've said that we have to raise the retirement age because people are living longer. Again, that makes sense intuitively, but on a rational basis, that makes less sense because when you look at the data, it turns out that only about half of us, the better off half, are living longer. And I could go into that at length, but that wouldn't convince most people of the need to act to enhance our retirement security. Studies have shown that the best way to motivate both policymakers and average people on a grassroots level, to do something to enhance retirement security is to tell stories of average people and the struggles that they face. So the research suggests that proponents of Social Security and retirement security would do well to get real people's faces and voices in front of policymakers in the media, rather than simply, putting out more numbers and more research, et cetera.
And that's, as we move to the next slide, that's what this story from Des Moines talks about. And I know we've got a variety of other material to cover. So could you tell us quickly about that?
Sure. This is a story of a senior at a retiree event at a senior center where Tom Harkin was speaking, talking about the struggles that she has getting by on Social Security and expressing her frustration that many in Washington are thinking of cutting Social Security rather than expanding it.
So Nancy, if we could bring you in as we go to the next slide, what can we do about this at this point? This is a daunting challenge, however we choose to address it.
Well, I'm actually here to bring us good news. You've been hearing lots of numbers and all the problems that we're facing, but this is one of the easiest problems facing the United States. It's also one where the American people are extremely united, both in understanding that there's a problem, but also in their unity over what the solution is. And the solution is actually quite simple. Every generation has improved Social Security. It's been a legacy that each generation has left for the ones that follow. And our generation should be no different. We should expand Social Security. Social Security is more efficient than any of its private sector counterparts. It spends less than 1% on administrative costs. More than 99 cents of every dollar goes to benefits. It covers virtually everyone. It's nearly universal. It's seen as it's very fair, and it's very secure because it's backed by the federal government. So it is the best system of providing retirement income. It provides not just retirement income, but disability income and income to children who are survivors of workers. And it is, and we are, as Eric said at the beginning, there's been a lot of misinformation, but we are the wealthiest country in the world. Social Security is extremely affordable. It would be affordable at much higher levels of benefits.
So we move to the next slide. What attempts are there to change Social Security for the better at this point?
And that's another piece of the good news, that the discussion in Washington has really disconnected from the American people. The American people are quite concerned about how they and their parents and grandparents are going to get by in their golden years, and they're concerned to make sure that they have that kind of security. The discussion in Washington has been all about how do we cut back these programs? We cannot afford them. They take money away from others and so forth. And that's, as I say, a real disconnect because we can afford them, and it's what the will of the people is, to expand them. Fortunately, we have some enlightened leaders in Washington who have recognized that. So Senator Tom Harkin, who unfortunately will be retiring, but he's introduced a bill to expand benefits across the board. A companion bill has been put in the House. Senator Begich of Alaska has introduced a bill. Senator Gwen Moore in the House has introduced bills. There have been a number of bills to expand Social Security. There are a variety of ways to do it and a variety of ways to pay for it. But the bottom line is there's beginning to be a growing momentum that this should happen. In addition, experts see this as the solution. There are academics. There are those like Ben and Eric and me who've worked in this issue for our entire careers, and we understand that Social Security expansion is something that can be done quickly. It could be done tomorrow, and it could be done in a very, very affordable way.
Well, that's good to hear. And are there other promising approaches as we move to the next slide?
There are a variety of approaches. Historically, we have both expanded Social Security and expanded private counterparts, and there are those who are working on that as well. But the important point is that Social Security, the American people understand how important it is, and but they've been led to believe that it's not affordable. Our policymakers are listening to the wrong voices, and that's why we've talked about the power of narrative. That it's easy to look at the numbers, but it's important to remember that behind every number is a person who's struggling to get by. So that we think that there's now a growing movement. We have a number of members of Congress who've introduced legislation. Thanks to the generous support of foundations, there are a number of organizations, both in Washington and around the country, that are making known the facts about Social Security. And it is all of those efforts, and there are academics as well who are doing the same thing. And the good news is that the policy is clear, and the American people see it and support it. So I think this is something that with continued support and continued work and continued effort, that eventually we will succeed.
As we move into our final slide, which gives some resources, had already a question about how to contact you and find out more about Social Security Works. Could you give us your basic website address?
Absolutely. It is strengthensocialsecurity.org. All one word, strengthensocialsecurity.org. And we indeed have a sign-up on our website, and we send out lots of emails letting people know when a bill has been introduced or when something's both on pro and con. When Senator Harkin's introducing his bill, we're having the birthday of Social Security is August 14th. We've got state reports about that. Those are all on our website. In addition, as we move into the fall with fights over the debt limit and continuing resolution, when Social Security is under attack, we let those who want to know that as well.
And in terms of the video that unfortunately we needed to skip past today, is that available on the website as well?
It is, and that is a very move. It again shows the power of the narrative. It shows a lot of what we've been talking about. It was, as Ben said, an event that Senator Harkin was at talking about expanding Social Security, and a woman who really brought home the retirement income crisis.
Well, thanks. With that, we're going to turn now to our questions, and a reminder to our audience that you can enter your questions in writing under the question box that's on the right of your screen. So please do that at this point or any point. But let's start with a question. I think I'll throw this out to Stacy and Eric first, and everyone can then respond as well. And that is, you're speaking to an audience primarily made up of funders. What do you see both larger national level funders doing in this arena, and particularly how do you think local smaller funders can be helpful? Eric, do you want to start? Oh, go ahead. Just go ahead, Stacy.
Actually, I wanted to start because I wanted to throw some final thoughts in there, but I'll say them now. That I think that often what happens is sometimes, we'll say what we're doing at Atlantic Philanthropies, and groups will say that's great, for Atlantic, that you can make large grants like that. But what about other funders? And I think funders can consider supporting education efforts in their own communities. We made a grant to the Center for Community Change to enable grassroots leaders to educate their communities about the retirement income crisis in 12 states. And you can find out more about those states, and they need local support also. So there are efforts going on in regions, in states, at the local level that funders can get involved with. The National Academy of Social Insurance, NACI, has delivered programmatic small grants to support community-based efforts like this also. They were initially funded by the Ford Foundation, but again, these groups can't stand on one funder alone, and they do need help to continue the work. So I think that local funders who say they can't fund what's going on inside the Beltway should consider supporting the voice of older adults and the education of the community on the ground. And I'm glad to talk to colleagues about that offline if they want also.
Eric, do you want to add to that?
Well, I would add one thing, which is identifying people locally and training them to be able to speak with the media, and the media at all levels, radio, small community papers, weekly papers, local regional papers. It's important to get people's voices there and to get people's stories out. I think local foundations, regional foundations can also play an important role in convening different groups to talk about this issue. The other thing is, just to add, be aware of the resources that exist out there. We just released our 50-state reports. 11 of them will be translated into Spanish, and actually 52 states, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Engage people to talk about this. The nation is facing a real crisis, and it's not just about today's old. It's very much a cross-generational issue. Aging, as we've said earlier, is not about today's old. It's about everyone who ages. Perhaps doing some cross-generational convening, but not the sensational type, which talks about the crisis in Social Security, but talk about the real concerns that people have in their lives and their families, and create that kind of discussion locally. would be helpful.
Okay. Nancy and Ben, I'll turn to the next question to you. I talked to, the questioner says, I talked to many young people, particularly college students, who do not feel that Social Security is a viable option for them. They're convinced that it will no longer provide any support for them whatever when they retire. And therefore, they're not politically supportive of Social Security. How do you respond to that?
I would respond in a couple of ways. First of all, it's one part of Social Security that's not well known, but that's very important, is its disability insurance protection and its survivor's protection. So those Social Security is providing wage insurance against the loss of wages and those eventualities. So although most young people don't realize it, they are benefiting from Social Security today. You don't have to be old. If they got hit by a truck, God forbid it, and wound up disabled and unable to work, Social Security would be there. Probably many of their friends, they may not even know it, but if a parent has passed away, they provide Social Security, steps in and provides support. So there's support going there right now to all generations. More importantly, though, the question is, what's the alternative? Social Security, there's been a lot of misinformation about it. At its most expensive, it will be only 6% of gross domestic product. It's very affordable, much less than many other countries. So the question is a political one. If they think that Social Security is important and they want it to be there, they should join the cause and become educated and educate their peers.
Yeah, and I think this also calls attention to an important role of funders in helping shape the debate and structure the debate around retirement security. You know, there's been a very concerted effort by some to undermine confidence in Social Security among young Americans. There have been well-funded efforts to fund textbooks, that are used in college classrooms around the country and modules within economics textbooks and political science textbooks that teach college students that Social Security won't be there for them and spread that narrative. There have also been well-paid efforts to spread that narrative in the media, well-funded efforts. And so there has been a very lopsided perception among many Americans and especially many young people towards Social Security in particular. And funders have a critical role to play in balancing that narrative so that so the country as a whole can come to terms with this very, important crisis. As depressing as all of the numbers were that we discussed today, we're doing almost nothing about it right now. Policymakers are paralyzed, and the full extent of the retirement security debate in Washington these days is how to cut Social Security rather than how to enhance retirement security. And so there's a critical role that funders could play, I think, in educating young people, but Americans generally, about the need for us to do something about the retirement security crisis.
Our next question is also a funder's type of question, but it's a slightly different one, which is that because of our tax status and other reasons, our trustees and staff are very averse to taking political stands. How could we be more successful in having our trustees support this kind of work if they feel it's, but particularly if they feel it's a potentially partisan debate?
There are two levels
Go ahead, Eric.
On that. One is it really is educational. There are educational opportunities for foundations to help advance the discussion. The second thing is that there are some clear administrative changes that are totally bipartisan, educating increasing the linguistic access of Social Security, working with groups to reduce the backlogs, playing a role in trying to deal with the office closings that are taking place and trying to educate the public about what the cost of long lines at Social Security is. So there's some less political concerns. And Nancy, I'm sorry, you were going to add something there.
No, I agree. This is really getting the facts out, getting it out in a variety of ways, getting it out through stories where people can grasp it, but it's also getting the real story out, the facts, and not the slant that's been going on. And to make a point about the bipartisan nature of this program has always been seen as bipartisan. And if you think of bipartisan as representing Republicans as well as Democrats, and you get away from Washington and the zero-sum game of politics, this program is overwhelmingly bipartisan. Polling we've done and others have done show that people who are part of the Tea Party movement have the same kind of support for this program that the most liberal members who have union members in their household answer these questions. This is not a liberal versus conservative approach. This is an approach that works. The American people are pragmatic, and part of it is to get the story out that it's very affordable, it's very conservatively managed, and it's a question of what the American people want.
Well, I think we probably have time for maybe one more, or more, maybe one or two. But the next question is around the multi-generational aspects of this program. Very often, the discussion turns around the conflict, or perceived or alleged conflict, between the needs of children, particularly poor children and often minority children, as opposed to the needs of those who are older and retired, particularly the people that live in gated communities and have their yachts, but they also collect Social Security. How do you address that issue?
I'll go back and actually encourage Hartford's on the line and others. The Gerontological Society of America did a study that I was involved with 20 years ago or more on the interdependence of generations. The short story was, you can create a fallacious notion of conflict between generations, and using that you can play off young against old, this and that. Or you can talk about how we're all in it together, how we are an interdependent group of people. And when you do that, you say, of course, older people have a stake in children's programs, even for many reasons, including the fact that younger people will support them. But you don't play off generations, and you also don't ignore the clear issues of social class. The middle class, the reason we have reduced poverty among older people is that we have Social Security and some other mechanisms we've invested in. The solution to the tremendously high poverty rates of children is not to pull apart Social Security. It's to have good education. It's to make the investments we can afford as a country. And my quick response, John, to go away from my longer response is, I think that's a red herring. The answer to addressing concerns about Social Security and how it affects young people is not to eviscerate Social Security protections for the young, which is basically what the generational warfare types invite us to do.
Well, and also,
if I can add,
go ahead.
If I can add, is the largest source of income for grandparents supporting their grandchildren, and it is also the largest children's program. Social Security is intergenerational, as we are strongest when we are all in there together. America doesn't look at their families as, oh, the grandparents are doing well, too bad for the grandchildren. Everybody rises or falls together.
Right, and Social Security is the country's largest anti-poverty program for children. It's interesting. Around 2043, the country is going to be a majority-minority society, there's some in minority communities who get the sense that just as they're retiring, that we're going to close the barn door on the way out, as it were, and cut Social Security, so that when we're a majority-minority society, that Social Security is a means-tested, meager program, and that would certainly not serve the interests of today's minority children. When they retire in 30, 40, 50, 60 years, they're going to be, the data that we presented today suggests that they're going to be more reliant on Social Security than today's retirees are. So they certainly have no interest in having Social Security dismantled before they retire.
I just add, John, one more thing, which is we should dream some. Social Security is not about the old. It's about all of us who face risks throughout life. We should be thinking of ways creatively to assist parents, perhaps through Social Security when they adopt or when they have a child born. We should be returning student benefits, which we once had for people in voc-ed or in college past age 21 if their parents had died or were disabled or retired. There are things we can do. We just have to think about how we want to do them.
And we can also support both programs because, Social Security is funded by a completely different funding mechanism than other children's programs. It's funded through the payroll tax, whereas other children's programs are funded through the regular budget. So they're not in conflict at all. And people who tend to play those two off against each other are actually in favor of cutting both programs for the poor and for children and programs for the elderly. And people who tend to support the poor also tend to support programs for the elderly. So it's really a red herring, as Eric said.
Well, with that, we need to turn toward the end of our program, and I'll ask each of you to give our audience a final word. And Nancy, I'll start with you.
Thank you. Well, I'm so pleased that we're having this today. Foundations throughout the history of Social Security, foundations have played an enormous role, both in educating the country, educating policymakers back in the 1920s, the 19-teens, the 1930s, and once and in expanding Social Security. Once it got going, foundations were free to turn their resources elsewhere because Social Security was there providing support. But we are once again facing some of the same conditions we faced back then, where there were talk about cutbacks, and foundations, I think, once again will in making our country the kind of country we all want to live in. Thanks.
Ben?
Yes, well, I second what Nancy said. It's definitely true that foundations have played a critical role throughout our history on this issue. And if we don't, if something doesn't happen to change the debate, we're not going to face this retirement income crisis sufficiently, and it's going to be a dramatic problem for our country in the coming decades. And I know the foundations have the power to do that, to inform policymakers, and I encourage them to do whatever is possible in that regard. And again, I don't think it's a political issue at all. I think bringing average Americans' stories, for example, into the media through media training for people on a local level, or through other creative ideas to get people's voices heard in Washington and in the media, that's an unpolitical thing. It's simply amplifying the voices of average people.
Eric?
I'll say thank you. Thank you for your concern and for listening in on this. I don't have a lot more to add. I just think this is terribly important. I appreciate John and the group who put this together. I guess I'd say just to know that there are people who work in this area, those of us who are on this webinar today, but also people through the National Academy of Social Insurance, people you can find on our two websites, socialsecurityworks.org and strengthensocialsecurity.org. There are good people around the country who know something about this issue, and if you have questions, please call, or if you want the names of other people, we'd be happy to provide them.
Stacy, you have the last word.
I shared that my final thoughts before, and I just wanted to thank GIA for bringing this issue to the forefront.
Well, I want to thank Stacy Easterling, the program executive with the Atlantic Philanthropies, Nancy Altman and Eric Kingston, the founding co-directors of Social Security Works, and Ben Bechte, the research director for Social Security Works, for their expertise in guiding us through these critical topics today. Thank you all for all that you do to improve the lives of older persons. I also want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation and the Atlantic Philanthropies for their support of today's webinar, and to the staff of the American Society on Aging for their technical expertise. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.